Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Fitzsimmons. I am the Associate Director of Programs and Public Events at the Autry Museum of the American West. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Autry is on the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva and recognize them, along with their neighbors, the Chumash and Tataviam, as the traditional caretakers of this land. So tonight's program features Jeffrey Ostler, the Beekman Professor of Northwest and Pacific History at the University of Oregon, as he discusses his book, Surviving Genocide, Native Nations and the United States from the American Revolution to Bleeding Kansas, which is the first part of a sweeping 2-volume history that investigates how American democracy relied on Indian dispossession and the federally sanctioned use of force to remove or slaughter Indians in the way of US expansion. He'll be in conversation with DeLanna Studi, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and the artistic director of Native Voices at the Autry, our resident equity theater company. DeLanna is also an accomplished actress and playwright whose play And So We Walked was based on a trip with her father to retrace the Trail of Tears, which was followed by her family when forced to leave their ancestral homelands. Please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and they will try to address as many as possible during the discussion. We'll also have a chat box available for you to exchange thoughts with your fellow audience members, but we do ask that all comments remain respectful, please. And now I will hand it over to DeLanna and Jeffrey for the conversation. Thank you all.
Wadoben. Osio, the Dawadon, the Lunagade, the Ann, Carol Chun Studi Kwood. Ani Chalagi, Gala Di Don. Hi, I'm DeLanna Studi. I'm a proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm speaking to you from the mighty Cherokee Nation, formerly known as Eastern Oklahoma. However, this is not our original homeland. Before colonization, this area was the homelands of the Kickapoo, the Osage, the Caddo, and the Ochete-Sacoan. I'd also like to take this time to acknowledge Zoom, the platform that we are using tonight, is headquartered in what is now called San Jose, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and the Tamian peoples. As our friends at Groundwater Arts remind us, the work we create together on a digital platform does not exist in the ether or in an imaginary void, but it was made possible because of the physical land and the Indigenous people who steward it. Hi, Jeff, welcome. It's such an honor for you to be here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, DeLanna. It's a pleasure. I'm speaking from the southern Willamette Valley of what's now known as Oregon, and is the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people, often referred to as Kalapuya Ilahi, after the Chinook jargon word for the land. I'd like to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so about the book, and then look forward to our conversation. What I tried to do in this volume, volume 1 of a 2-volume work, was to provide a comprehensive overview of the impact of US expansion or the building of the US empire on Native nations. And my real focus here was on Native nations east of the Mississippi River. And so the time period of this volume is really from the 1750s up until the eve of the Civil War. And I wanted to show a map of the geography of the book. This is the cover. And then the map shows you the various Native nations and their really traditional homelands. And most of it, as I say, is east of the Mississippi River, but the geography of the book necessarily moves a little bit west of the Mississippi River, because that's the area that the United States will eventually try to move most of the Eastern nations into. And it shows the homelands of those nations kind of in what we would now think of as the Midwest, including where you are, DeLanna, in the eastern part of Oklahoma. So the book has, I guess you could say, a 2-part argument. And the first part of the argument is simply this, that throughout this history, Native people believed that they faced the very real possibility of what we would today call genocide. And in the course of the book, I give several examples of Native leaders talking about that. And so I want to give one example. I'm just going to read a little bit from one example in the book. And it's really from right at the time of the Declaration of Independence. At that same time, a delegation of Mohawks, Ottawas, Shawnees, Nanticotes, and Delawares traveled to the Cherokee capital of Chota on the Little Tennessee River in southeastern Tennessee. And what they were doing was that they were going to ask Cherokees to join a movement of Native American nations fighting to retain their independence against colonial expansion. And at Chota, an unnamed, we don't have his name, Shawnee spokesman, spoke of a long history of injustice toward Indigenous people. Here's what he said. He related that, quote, the Virginians, and this was a term that Native people applied not only just to Virginia colonists, but also all the American colonists. The Virginians, he said, had taken away all their lands and had unjustly brought war upon their nation. And he said that because of that, the Shawnees had been reduced from a great people to a handful. And he also elaborated, he said in general, he said about the red people generally. They had once been masters of the whole country, but now they hardly possessed enough ground to stand on. And he said, look, lands where Indians had recently hunted, quote, were thickly inhabited and covered with forts and armed men. And then he said, wherever a fort appeared in their neighborhood, they might depend that there would soon be towns and settlement. And so he looked at all of that and he told his audience, he said, it is plain there was an intention to extirpate them. And that word extirpation is really, I think, a synonym for genocide. And that's what he thought his people and the other nations he was talking to were up against. And so that's part one of the two-part argument that I make. And the second part is that when Native people made that argument, it was reasonable for them to do so, given what the United States was actually up to. And so that's really what I want to talk about now for a minute, is the reasonableness of these fears of extirpation or of genocide. And one way of doing this is to begin by observing that a major goal of the United States at its inception was to take native lands and replace native people with settlers. And of course, some of the settlers would be farming their own lands, some would be exploiting the labor of enslaved people of African descent. Now, the United States, what it ideally would have wanted would have been for native people all on that map to willingly agree to give up their lands. Just let's do it willingly in exchange for help towards civilization. But of course, native people don't really want to do this. And then what happens is that under pressure, the United States gets some native leaders to sign treaties. And I want to emphasize that there's a great deal of coercion involved in that. But then, of course, many native leaders don't sign treaties, and they regard the treaties as illegitimate. And then they organize multinational resistance movements. And this happens, that's what the Shawnee spokesman is trying to do, and this continues happening for decades. The United States then regards these movements of resistance as illegitimate. You can't do this, they say, and then it sends armies to attack native communities. Now, the Northwest Ordinance, which of course is 1787 and is really almost a part of the Constitution, not technically, but it's part of that same moment. The Northwest Ordinance refers to just and lawful wars against the Indians. But what are those wars? And what I argue in the book is that these are in fact genocidal wars, and that what the military wants to do is to try to surprise native communities and kill large numbers of people in the course of surprising them. And these will be not just fighters, but these will be children, it will be women, and it will be elders. And in many cases, they're not actually successful in doing that. They can't actually succeed in realizing that intention. but sometimes they are successful. And one of the instances in which they were comes in 1832, and it comes during the Blackhawk War, where Blackhawk, who was a Sauk leader, was trying to make it, was trying to resist the United States forcing his people to abandon their villages on the east bank of the Mississippi and move west. And in the course of that resistance, the United States went after his people, and at a place called the Bad Axe Creek, which empties into the Mississippi River, they succeeded. And this is what then genocide actually looks like. And I have a slide of the Bad Axe Massacre. And you can see what's happening is people are just trying to get away from the troops. And they've actually built a makeshift raft and they're trying to get across the river. And, there's a steamship there with a cannon firing on, everybody, men, women, children, older people as well. And so that's what genocide actually looks like when it can be accomplished. Now, as time goes by, the United States has the capacity to do more than just chip away at native lands. And by the 1820s, it can begin to think about implementing a policy of Indian removal. And that policy, of course, is formally adopted in 1830 under Andrew Jackson's administration as the Indian Removal Act. Now, the goal of removal is not actually to destroy communities, to destroy nations. And in fact, the policy is put forward, I think dishonestly, but it is put forward as a benevolent policy, a policy that is supposedly necessary in order to save Indians from some inevitable fate of disappearing or vanishing, was the kind of language that was used to justify the policy. So even though the policy, though, wasn't intended to destroy, it actually had that result. And even before the policy was implemented, Native people realized that it was likely to have the destructive consequences that it would. And Native leaders consistently appealed to American public officials, presidents, secretaries of war, state governors, and so on, not to move us. Let us stay where we are. That's the only way we can really be saved. And so the Cherokee leadership, for example, under enormous pressure to remove in the early 1830s, wrote a petition to the US government. And one of the things they said, very simple, if we are compelled to leave our country, we see nothing but ruin. And they were prophetic. They understood their situation. Of course, US leaders, Andrew Jackson most famously, would kind of pat them on the head as though they were little children and say, well, you guys don't really know what's best for you. I'm your great father, and I know what's best for you, and you have to go. So there were then multiple removals. And I think the best known in sort of the general public, the ones most taught about, are the removals of the southeastern nations, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, but they're also less known, but I think also very important that we realize, nations from the north. And one of the things I tried to do in the book was talk about the southern nations and their experiences, but also to talk equally about the removals of the northern nations. And I wanted to just show a couple of the maps from the book where I tried to show the removal routes. They're kind of complicated, but you can see several communities are forced out in the 1830s and 40s out of northeastern, eastern Ohio and Indiana. You can see most of the routes that they take, and most of them actually wound up being forced into what becomes Kansas. And then there's another map of some additional removals that show there are multiple removals of Potawatomis, kind of out of the Illinois, Indiana, southern Michigan area, some into Kansas. And I also showed on the upper right-hand side A lot of Potawatomis tried to evade removal by simply relocating with relatives in Canada, and several thousand people actually just fled the United States. And then there's other removals on that map as well. But I just very briefly wanted to give people kind of a picture of some of the complexity of all the different removals. And this process goes on for decades. It's not just something that occurs for 2 or 3 years. It's going on in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And another thing I tried to go into in the book is how, okay, we have all these people being moved forcibly from the east to the west, but it's not like the places that they're going to be moved to are like just some empty wilderness or something. These are also the lands of other indigenous people. And so we need to take into account the impact. If we're really thinking about what is the impact of this policy, we have to take into account the impact of the policy on Osages, Kansas, Kaws, and other groups that are indigenous to what's now the Midwest. And in order to make room for the peoples coming in from the East, the government forced the people already in the West to reduce their lands, to sometimes move, sort of not that far, but within that region, and often onto undesirable lands. And so that also had negative consequences. And overall, the death tolls from removal are shockingly high. And that's due to a combination of interrelated factors. There's malnutrition, there's outright starvation. These processes of deracination produce social stress. They're traumatic. That has an impact on people. People are impoverished, in short, and they're very vulnerable to a variety of diseases. And we're not just talking about maybe smallpox one year or something like that. We're talking about multiple diseases year after year, viral diseases, bacterial diseases, and so on. And we're talking about some nations maybe lost 20, 30% of their populations during these periods, others more. I documented some nations losing 40, 50, or even 60, 70% over the course of 2 or 3 decades as they're subject to this process. So these are catastrophic situations. And so it's clearly a policy, the removal policy clearly, I think, has genocidal consequences. And so even though it seems to me that even though officials might not have intended the policy at the beginning to have those consequences, it became clear after a few years that it was having terrible consequences. And at that point, US leaders had a choice. And they could have said, okay, our policy is actually not helping. We said it would be helpful, but it's actually very harmful. We'll stop it. But of course, that's not what they said. They didn't care. They went ahead with this policy knowing that it had genocidal consequences. And what I argue in the book is that that's tantamount to pursuing an intent to destroy, to continue pursuing a policy with those consequences. Now, finally, though, I want to emphasize, and I tried to emphasize in the book and would like to here as well, that through all of this, Native people were resilient. They survived. And I tried to give several examples throughout the book of different ways that this happened. So how did people, they knew they were threatened existentially, they knew the work was survival. What did that involve? Some of it involved just simply military skill. Sometimes they were able to fend off US armies. Some of it involved crafting plans so that when armies approached, they evacuated and guarded against casualties. Some of it involved having to rebuild towns and communities after they were burned, because the army might go in, it maybe couldn't kill as many people as it wanted, but it could burn the place down. They did that all the time. People had to rebuild. Some of it involves pursuing new economic strategies in new lands. You have to rebuild your communities when you've been moved and create new economies. Some of it involves forming temperance societies to combat the scourge of alcohol. Just something inflicted from the outside, but people knew they had to combat it. Some of it involves diplomacy, forming alliances with missionaries, forming alliances with other Native communities, and so on. And some of it involved, I think, just what's conveyed in the piece of art that the press used for the cover of the book. And so just to end with that last image, this is, it's a watercolor actually, produced by a Choctaw historian in 1966, Valjean Hessing, and it depicts the Choctaw removal. And so she knew, in creating this piece, obviously that her people had survived removal. And I think it really shows you something about her vision of what that survival meant. And I think there's a lot going on here. But, I think one of the things that really comes through to me is care of relatives and kinship. So yeah, that's the image that I would like to leave people with.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a beautiful slideshow. I really appreciate it. And I actually want to take this moment to say thank you for writing this book and for the diligent research that you did and your outreach to Native scholars and historians. Usually people don't go to us to find these stories. So I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you. Thank you for speaking truth to a part of our history that's been so often erased. Now I'm probably going to embarrass you a little bit. I was doing some research, as I should be doing, and I saw that Peter Nabokov of the New York Book Review of Books said that you were intense and well-researched, ambitious, magisterial, and surviving genocide sets a bar from which subsequent scholarship and teaching cannot retreat. And I want to acknowledge it and say thank you.
Well, thanks very much. He was very kind in writing about the book. Yeah.
Well, I know one of the things that this brings me to is okay, just full disclosure for everyone out there, I had the wonderful opportunity of speaking with Jeff before, so I have a little bit of insight that you don't. However, I did divulge to him that this was a very difficult book for me to read. My people suffered from removal, and I recently retraced my footsteps with my father along the Trail of Tears, and it's still very fresh in me. And one of the great things about this book is, yes, it talks about the atrocities, but it also shows the resilience and the hope. And that is something I want to thank you. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about your process. What was your personal journey in telling the story?
Yeah. I started thinking about this book a long, long time ago. I had written about the Lakota Sioux and had written about some of the massacres that they experienced in particularly Wounded Knee. And I'd started thinking more about the question of genocide in American history. There'd been a debate about that. It's ongoing. It had already existed. And it eventually drew me to say, we don't really have in the scholarly literature, we don't really have an overview of all of this. We've got many, many pieces. The books behind me are just a very small portion of some of the library of very good work, done by many, many scholars, native and non-native, on this history. But what I thought I would try to do would be to kind of put together a more general or comprehensive synthetic picture. And so I started doing research and then writing it about 10 years ago now. And so, it was a challenge just to kind of manage and learn about so many different histories and events and try to piece things together in a way that was coherent. There's also, of course, ups and downs in writing, and you're not sure you can do it or if you're going to do it very well. And ways in which you probably have not succeeded completely and so on. So there's that. There's also, writing about this history is, there's happier histories to write about, but it is a history where I felt a lot of anger, frankly, at the deceit, just honestly, the deceit of American officials and our continued ignorance of these things, that's ongoing. But, I also felt hope, here, because, if, and I think that's something I've learned from Native people is if Native people can go through the kind of histories they've gone through at present and be hopeful, as I know many people are, but struggle to be, but are, then that's something to learn from.
No, thank you, Jeff. And it shows in your work. I know that you were part of this process. There was an essay book that was called "You Cannot Teach United States History Without American Indians." And in your book, you mentioned there's no shortage of books on the Founding Fathers, but it is possible to read stacks of them without learning a thing about let me see if I can say this right, the Genocide or the Moravian Massacre. And why do you think that erasure still exists?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question as to, we have a huge fascination with the founding fathers, as we say, and but I don't think we have even, this is certainly true of conservative historians who are always calling, for patriotic history and so on, and are pushing back on 1619 project or taking down statues and things like that. But even among liberal historians, I think that there's a reluctance, I think, to really reckon with the fact that, central to the founding of the United States in 1776 and then the Constitution is the taking of native lands, and that process is going to be violent, and it's going to be destructive. And so, the Genocide massacre comes at the end of the Revolutionary War. The people who were killed by Pennsylvania militia were completely peaceful. If anything, they were pro-American and cooperated with settlers as much as they could. They had converted to Christianity. And, it's a real atrocity. And I don't think it's incidental, to the Revolutionary War and all that was happening, because I think that at the center of that was the freedom that colonists wanted from Britain to be able to do what they wanted on the continent by themselves. And that involved, unimpeded taking of native lands. The Crown was trying to regulate that.
And that just brings up something I also wanted to ask you about. You use the term settler colonialism instead of just colonialism. Can you talk about the difference and why you've chosen to use settler colonialism?
Yeah. The concept of settler colonialism for people viewing this, some will recognize this and others may not, is a concept that got to be and has been kind of part of discussions in Native American and Indigenous studies and other related fields for the last 10 years or so. And it really came out of Australians, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people thinking about the situation in Australia, because people there were saying things like, look at South Asia. India did become independent of Great Britain, and the British left. I mean, there's still after effects, but it's nothing. Nobody's gone from here. The settlers are still here, and so people wanted to make a distinction between settler colonialism and what's sometimes called franchise colonialism, where in settler colonialism, the purpose of colonialism is not so much to exploit labor of Indigenous people, but to get their land and have settlers settle on it. And so that kind of situation has a different sort of logic. It will unfold differently and with different consequences. And so I do see, and I think most scholars now are seeing the United States as a settler colonial empire, settler colonial nation or society.
Now, you mentioned that during the formative years of the United States, there was this mounting crusade to eliminate natives. In your research, do you think that removal could have been prevented?
Yeah, this is this is a somewhat vexing question, I think, because I think most historians who've written on the removal policy probably would say maybe it could have been prevented. And scholars have often said, there was a kind of sincere commitment on the part of some of the early presidents and other political leaders to this policy of kind of civilizing Native people, and that might have allowed for people not to have been moved. And that, a kind of new group of people, and maybe particularly associated with Andrew Jackson, came onto the scene and really pushed a completely new policy forward over a great deal of opposition, not just Native opposition, but internal opposition in terms of the US political structure. And people have noticed, certainly noted, that the Indian Removal Act of 1830 actually very narrowly passed the House of Representatives, very close vote. And people have noticed that, and they've said, well, maybe it could have gone a different way. And there are a lot of people speaking out against removal. But in my view, the people speaking out against removal were mainly saying, we're not doing it by a legitimate process. And they were particularly critical of the way in which the state of Georgia was putting pressure on Cherokees, as you know, and Andrew Jackson's encouragement of that. And they said they wanted the process to unfold in what they would have regarded as a more honorable manner, a less coercive manner. But I think they felt that it did need to happen eventually. So I think the arguments are actually more about process. And I think that the forces for removal throughout the country were sufficiently strong kind of all along that something like what happened was probably going to happen. But that's a point that, historians, I'm sure good historians would probably disagree with me on that point, but that is the way I see it.
No, thank you for that. That's one of the questions I've always had myself, especially given the complicated removal situation of the Cherokee. We do have a question in the Q&A. I'll go ahead and ask that of you. Is it true that some pilgrims were sympathetic to the removal of natives? I was told that the people crying on the Trail of Tears were the non-natives watching the natives on the trail.
Let me just bring that up. Well, I'm not so sure. The reference to pilgrims, of course, would refer to the pilgrims, coming into Plymouth Rock much earlier. And I do talk about that just briefly at the very beginning of the book and talk a little about New England. But I think the question must be more about a broader concept of pilgrims as non-natives observing. And no, I don't think so. I think that although there were observers, non-native observers, who felt sympathy for people being removed and sometimes provided them with assistance and wrote about sometimes this as a bad thing. I think the Trail of Tears metaphor is an Indigenous metaphor. I think that it is something that people at the time and soon after started talking about. This is our experience. So, and other Native communities developed, other metaphors for this. Sometimes, well, the Potawatomis, for example, say that one of their removals they call the Trail of Death. So, but again, that's really, I think, their term for what they went through. Yeah.
No, thank you, Jeff. I really like that answer because it does put it in the Native perspective. And so thank you for that. I kind of want to talk about just the overall silence of what was happening. I know that the American government saw deaths happening and they refused to report it. In fact, I don't think they even mentioned that deaths were happening or they were necessary deaths. And I know when I was on the trail, we would go to different forts where natives were interred, especially the Cherokee, and they called them immigration depots. And so it's fascinating how the choice of words colored the experience.
Yeah.
And do you have any opinions about that? Do you mind like talking about what you learned in this process?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a whole thing of euphemisms, you know, in this history, and I think it's true at the time, and a lot of passive voice, you know, that Indians were going to disappear. Well, how, you know? And people said these kinds of things. And then an immigration depot strikes me as a pretty blatant euphemism. People have started calling these camps detention camps, which gets, I think, a little closer, concentration camps, which, you know, has various resonances, of course, in post-Holocaust times. And I think those are more appropriate. Now, another thing would be the terminology we use for removal. Scholars are increasingly saying, you know, removal may not really convey enough about the harshness and the coerciveness. And so people are saying maybe eviction is better. That I think is a better word, or expulsion. That conveys something of it more. So I do think all the way through these histories we've read, people have put forward certain justifications. They've ignored and erased certain kinds of things. And I think that, you know, we're in a process where more people are more saying we need to have better language to describe, you know, what happened.
And we have another question I'm going to throw at you from our audience. It's what pushback have you gotten over the use of genocide in relation to removals, as opposed to referring to this as an example of ethnic cleansing?
Cleansing, yeah. Yeah, Steve Aaron, yeah. Hi, Steve. You know, I haven't really gotten direct pushback. So part of this could be that, you know, in the era of COVID where we can't go to conferences and we don't get to be in the hallways and have people come up and accost us, you know, with like, why do you, you know? And so, and in, you know, some of the reviews of the book, I haven't really heard that pushback. Most reviewers have kind of accepted my argument on genocide, so I'm happy about that. But I'm sure there's people who would be skeptical. And ethnic cleansing has been a very common term, and recently, particularly to describe removal in the scholarly literature. My view on that is that, you know, yes, it was ethnic cleansing, but that ethnic cleansing has consequences, and what are they? And so you could say, okay, the agenda of removal is ethnic cleansing. We want to move people. That seems like just a synonym, you know. And people at the time were talking about sweeping was a metaphor that some of the missionaries to the Cherokees actually used to describe removal. So yes, but then the question is, what consequences do ethnic cleansing projects have? And people who've looked at ethnic cleansing projects in Europe, for example, in the 20th century, have demonstrated, and I think it's very clear in this case as well, that when you try to forcibly remove people in the first place, you're going to have to use violence and threat of violence. And so one of the things I didn't really mention in, you know, my opening is that although most of the communities that were forced west went without taking up arms to try to stop it. I mean, most Cherokees, for example, didn't do that. But they were constantly being threatened with genocidal violence if they didn't pick up and move voluntarily. I think Cherokees were very aware of the fact that the army would go after them, and they knew what American and colonial armies could do from their previous history. But some nations did decide to resist removal, and the Seminoles are a case of that. And there's a lot of violence there. It's not just sort of ethnic cleansing, without any violence. There's a huge amount of violence there, and in some of the other cases. And then I think we have to look at the consequences too. And so I do argue that this particular policy of ethnic cleansing has genocidal consequences. So that's kind of my argument.
And I love how you presented in your slideshow about how, with the massacre, that it wasn't just attacking the men or the warriors, it was attacking the elderly, the children, and the women.
Yeah.
And I love how you do not shy away from that. And that's very important because, as you know, with our murdered and missing Indigenous women and the effects of jurisdiction and who we are today, that is still a way to, I believe, keep our Native people down, is by attacking the women. It's this war on women. And so I want to say thank you for addressing that. Some people don't even address that. So I'm just very honored that you would be that brave. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I did try, one of the scholars I learned from on this issue was Sarah Deer. And her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, is one, but there's others too. But her work in particular, I think, has been so important for telling me and other people who may not have really appreciated this.
No, thank you. As a Native woman, I'm very aware of how much our women are left out of history. So thank you. And you were talking about the consequences of the removals. I think one of the big misconceptions is that people died on the trails. And don't get me wrong, they did die on the trails, but that wasn't the only cause of their destruction. Do you mind elaborating a little bit more on that?
Yeah. Well, I felt that, to understand, and so in my own research, at a certain point, I started to realize, to really understand the consequences of this policy, we need to look at, when people were being rounded up from their homes and, forcibly evicted from their homes, and then into these concentration camps. In the case of Cherokees, as you know, sometimes thousands of people were in those camps for months, and they were death traps, and so we need to take into account of that, and then the trails themselves. But then I also felt that it was important to look at, so what happens after people get to the West, and how successful are they at rebuilding their communities? We know they're going to make their best efforts, but they're in new lands. Sometimes they don't have clean water. There's just basic questions of infrastructure. They've lost a lot of their healthcare experts, all of these kinds of things. And they're being moved into a new disease environment in many cases. So a lot of the Eastern peoples had, were fairly, in terms of just basic immunity to a known disease environment, are moved into a new one. And so I think you need to really think about the consequences after the Trails of Tears. And I tried to do that as well. So there's kind of three phases there. And we're talking about years of really thinking through the consequences. Yeah.
No, thank you. I feel like we in America like to simplify things, and it's very basic, and we don't think about what leads up to it and the consequences afterwards. And it's something I recently, because of the land acknowledgements, we've been doing this at the Native Voices and the Autry for over 20 years now. And I think your map exemplifies this, but we're not moving natives onto lands that weren't already occupied. And so what do we do with those people? And so that map, the second slide that you shows just how populated the United States was. And that's something I feel like we also never really talk about.
Yeah.
And oh, Steve Aaron has sent you a nice little compliment. He says, "Thank you for this book, Jeff. You tell such an important history. Can you tell us what kind of response the book is getting with public, non-academic audiences?"
Well, thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it. Steve, many people in the audience will know Steve as UCLA professor, and also his work. I mean, Steve's work is cited all throughout my book on, particularly Kentucky and Missouri, and very helpful to me in writing about those things. Well, I've given some presentations about the book. I talked to, for example, a group of high school teachers here in Oregon through the Oregon Historical Society, because our state has mandated, some fairly serious good things in K through 12 relating to the teaching of Indigenous history. And so people, I think people want to know about this history. They want to, at that level, they want to know, teachers want to know better how they can teach this history, what to read, what are some of the tricky issues when you start talking about genocide, or, what terms should we use for Native people? I mean, just things like that. So I've had some good conversations, even in the Zoom world, with audiences like that, for example. Yeah. And I've talked a little with some audiences about, because people are interested in the question of COVID and its disproportionate impact on Native communities, and are aware of that. And one of the things that I think is important, and that we can really appreciate from what's going on right now, is that there's a kind of general idea out there among the public that when we think about Native Americans and disease, the only thing we really need to know about is these so-called virgin soil epidemics, which was when, there's first contact with the first ships that show up somewhere in the Americas. And the idea of the virgin soil epidemic theory is that, Europeans on those ships have crowd diseases that they've become immune to, smallpox and measles, and that because Western Hemisphere people don't have immunity to those diseases, there's this huge die-off of everybody. And we scholars are really rethinking that theory, because for one thing, it doesn't really appear that it holds true all the time, because you don't necessarily have sick people on every single ship. And also, you need transmission. And, it doesn't seem like it really happens quite that way. It happens sometimes, but not as universal as we thought. And more the story of disease and health now is tied up with colonialism. And so, just what I've been talking about removal as a colonial policy and the effects that it has on health. It promotes the spread of disease, it weakens bodies, you get low, reduced fertility, you get higher infant mortality, you get damage to healing, indigenous systems of healing, and so on. And that's all connected. With colonialism. And so then if we think of the situation of some reservation communities that have really been hit hard by COVID, we can see ongoing factors related to colonialism continuing to be at play. So, I've had some chance to sort of try to talk about that to some audiences.
No, thank you, Jeff. I think that's one of the fascinating things about your book was, I know you started working on it 10 years ago before 2020 happened, but I feel it really resonates on a visceral level because of what's going on in our world right now. And I also feel it's a great book for right now, just because it was during this time that people are wanting to hear the other narrative of history. You've seen the toppling of Confederate statues because people are finally talking about the history of those. as before it was just a statue, but now we know why people are wanting them gone. And
Yeah.
so I really appreciate that you're willing to complicate the narrative of history that so many of us have been taught. We only have a few more minutes left, and I have so many questions for you. Uh, oh, here we go. I should make clear that while I share the sentiment about Jeff's book, the last compliment was from Kelly Little Hernandez. For some reason, she is signed on as me on the Zoom, so that was from Kelly. Okay.
Okay, Kelly, why did you do that? Yeah, okay.
We
Thank you
give
so
credit where
much.
credit is due. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess my next question for you is, in your research, did you find anything that just shocked or surprised you or you didn't know before?
One of my research questions early on, DeLanna, was I wanted to know during the early period before removal, where all the US officials are saying, you know, native populations are decreasing, these people are vanishing, and we have to save them, right? I wanted to know if that was really true. And so I tried to figure this out. And the question was, if you took the native population of what becomes the Eastern United States in, let's say, 1776, and then moved to 1830 on the eve of removal, did the total native population in that geography increase or not? And my hypothesis was that it probably decreased slightly because land is being taken and there's violence. But what I came up with, the answer to the research question, was that the native population overall was actually increasing. And what that showed me is that even under fairly oppressive conditions of land loss, that native people, provided they kept a certain amount of their land, even though it's being chipped away at and taken, and they were fighting to stop that process, that they were able to adapt in certain ways so that they were able to actually increase their populations. That surprised me. And it's kind of strange in a way. I mean, I'm making an argument that there's genocide going on, but at a certain period in this history, populations are actually increasing. And so that surprised me, but I think it also really drove home to me the fact that the policy of removal is based on just a lie. It's just not true.
And then I know you talk about Bleeding Kansas. That's historically known as the tragic prelude to the Civil War. Why was it necessary for you to discuss this event?
Yeah, I felt, and how I end the volume is really talking about what happens in Kansas. I talk about what happens in Oklahoma, with your people and others who are relocated there. But I really felt that the situation in Kansas in the 1850s was not at all understood by American historians or the American public. We know, of course, it's a chapter in all US history textbooks that, Kansas is organized as a territory, and instantly people come in from the free states who want to establish Kansas as an anti-slavery free state, and people come in from Missouri to try to establish Kansas as a slave state. And in the mid-1850s, they clash and there's violence. John Brown is out there. He famously slaughters some pro-slavery settlers at Osawatomie Creek. And this is a prelude to the Civil War, this sort of violent outbreak of conflict there between free state and slave state people. And so that's happening, but it's just never appreciated that this is happening on Indigenous lands, and it's happening on lands that Native people have been moved to. And so, whether everyone would take the side of the anti-slavery people in that fight, but we don't think enough about how these are both settlers, both groups are settlers, and they're coming onto Indigenous lands. and the consequences. So I think that about 50 people were killed in the political violence in Kansas, 50 white people. And in 1856 alone, 400 Kansas or Kaws died of smallpox. And that should be something everyone knows, I think. That should be as much known as John Brown and the Osawatomie Massacre.
I appreciate you bringing it to light in your book. I do have a few more questions, if you don't mind. I could talk all night, and I don't really want to take up all your time, but you talk about truth and reconciliation commissions. Does America need one?
You know, I don't know. I wanted to raise that issue in the book, and now, of course, you know, we just recently had legislation that I guess would be introduced in the House by Deb Haaland, but in the Senate by Elizabeth Warren for a Truth and Healing Commission is what they're going to call it, that would really center on boarding schools and kind of follow, I think, the Canadian model on residential schools. And that all seems good to me, I guess. But I don't know. And I feel like the first thing to say on that is I think it's really up to Native people to decide whether that's what is a good thing or not. You know, I know in California that there's a process underway, you know, that the governor and there's Native communities involved in a kind of California Truth and Healing Commission. I don't know if this is something that Native nations in the US want to do or not. If people did want to do it, maybe there's other agendas that would be better to pursue, you know, in advancing tribal sovereignty and advancing the return of land and all the other things. You know, if there was such a commission, I think that one thing it would do conceivably would be to further the education of the broader American public. And that would be a good thing. There's other ways to do this. I don't know that it needs that, but my sense is it would probably be a good thing, you know, but only if you know, this is something you know, that you guys want to put on the table.
Well said. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And I love this book. I think it's a book that everyone in America should read. I think it should be required reading in all history courses. I do understand it's the first of 2 volumes. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going to happen in volume 2?
Yeah, so in volume 2, what I want to do is write about the similar processes unfolding really in the American West. And, you know, I want to continue with Oklahoma after the Civil War for sure, but also go out really into all parts of the West, and including my own area, where, you know, I've lived here for 30 years and I know some of the history, but I've really been now thinking through the history of settler colonialism in the Northwest and learning a lot about that. So that's what it will be, is kind of centering on the American West and going up to probably the turn of the century into the 20th century. I really want to do a real close look at what's happening on various reservations in terms of public health, in terms of the impact of the Dawes Act, in terms of, you know, the imposition of this really very strong imposition of policies of stamping out language, culture, religion, and try to give a bit of an overview of all of those things.
No, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for helping us tell the truth. Your last name, Ostler, just so you know, in Cherokee, we have a word for good, and it's oast. And so you did well, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks. I can't wait to tell my Cherokee colleague in English, Kirby Brown, that.
Osta. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. Now, we're about closing out. Is there any parting words you'd like to tell the audience that we have? Is there anything that you would like to say before we close?
Well, no, I don't think so. I, just really appreciate you having this conversation with me and a chance to kind of talk about, what I've been thinking about. So,
Well, I can't wait till volume 2. Do you have an estimated time when that's going to come out?
yeah, it's taking longer than I might have thought. I would have thought that I knew more about the American West than I do, and I'm having to learn a lot. And so I don't know. And I'm going to retire fairly soon, so people have described retirement as permanent sabbatical, so I'll have maybe more time.
We'll see. Yes.
We'll see.
But yes, so I'll be waiting patiently for volume 2. But for those of you who are listening in today, just so you know, volume 1 is out and you can purchase it at the Autry bookstore. So you can go to shop.theautry.org and you can get that book. Once again, Jeff, thank you so much for spending this evening with us and for letting me ask you all my questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, DeLanna. Be well.
You too. Take care.
Yeah.
Good night.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.